Well, good morning once again, brethren. Mr. Fisher's sermonette ties in with what I had been thinking about for the sermons. Interesting how often those things work out that way. We live in a society that, to a great extent, places value on things based on money, based on material things. That seems to be one of the primary aspects of our society is the emphasis on materialism and on money, on what what someone has, how much they make, what kind of all of the outward physical things. I think we understand that though that is a value system, that while it permeates so much of our society, that's not a value system that's going to endure. That's not the value system that is going to be perpetuated on into the time ahead of us in the world that is to come, the world that Jesus Christ will rule over. There has been a great deal of pressure on our families in recent decades. Throughout this century, that pressure has been increasing as our culture has become increasingly materialistic. And we, of course, are seeing some of the results in terms of what has happened to our families that are there. It's an amazing thing that has happened in terms of the violence that exists, the youth-on-youth violence, these crazy situations at some of the schools, of course, the terrible tragedy in Colorado. But that wasn't a totally isolated event. In more recent times, there have been several situations along that line, maybe not quite of the same magnitude, but over and over these sort of things are happening. And people look for something, what is the fault? Where is the problem? And some of them are assured, they're convinced, all the problem is because of guns. Well, they used guns, that's right, but the problem didn't, of course, originate with the guns. Number one, there are a lot of laws on the books that were broken before they ever started shooting anybody. Most of what they had obtained was obtained illegally. It was against the law. I remember back in terms of the availability of guns. I remember back as a kid growing up, of course, in the rural South. But it was very common that people have gun racks in their pickups with rifles or shotguns. Be parked there at school. Nobody ever gave a thought to it because you never had an incident like that. The problem isn't just that guns are available. Cain didn't need a gun to kill Abel. That's where murder started. Sometimes it enables people to do it more efficiently. It enables them maybe to do on a grander scale. But the root of the problem, if you could eliminate all guns, if you could just snap your finger and eliminate all guns, it would not eliminate violence. We're told in the days of the pre-flood world that the earth was filled with violence. And there wasn't a gun available. So the problem didn't originate with the weapons. It originated in the hearts of people. You can look at various other things. Here we are, an affluent culture. We have more things than people of any other time period. You can go back in periods of history and realize that the average person today in the United States lives more comfortably than the richest kings and potentates of centuries past, with all of the things that we have for our comfort. Well, what we find increasingly in America has been a breakdown in terms of the family unit. And we find that many times people may live under the same roof and be virtual strangers to one another, sort of coming and going independent lives. There has been a tremendous breakdown of the stability of the family. And I want to focus in on some things from Scripture today. We, this particular weekend is a weekend that for a number of years, a number of decades, since the early part of this century, has been focused in on giving honor to mothers, and that is a biblical principle to honor your father and your mother, and we find many examples throughout Scripture. In terms of value, we know what our society puts a value on, but I would like to ask you the question, what are the most valuable things that a woman can give to her family? What are the most valuable things that she can provide or that she can do? Because is it when you look at just materialistic things, is that doesn't solve the problem? So many times in families that are affluent, that doesn't guarantee success. Now, material things can be a blessing when they're used properly and when they are seen in proper perspective. But let's look at some things of great value. I want to focus in on three. There may be others that you can come up with, but I think these three stand out, from the pages of Scripture as three very key things, three very valuable elements that a woman can provide and can give in her family. Let's start with the quality of loyalty. Now, you could say loyalty, you could say faithfulness, you could use a lot of terms, but there's a great contrast. The Bible talks, of course, a lot about women, talks a lot about men, but it uses examples, both good and bad. We have in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, we find Israel is personified as a woman and is likened to being the bride of Christ. We find that example with the congregation of Israel in the Old Testament and with the Church of God in the New Testament. We find that sometimes the term woman is used metaphorically. The church is described as a chaste virgin, espoused to Jesus Christ, faithfully awaiting the coming of the bridegroom. On the other hand, we find some very unflattering pictures that are also given. The false church is described as a great whore in Revelation chapter 17, having given birth to various harlot daughters. And we find those illustrations used throughout Scripture. We find outstanding women of faith and faithfulness that are illustrated. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, is held up as an example, and we find in the New Testament, Peter said, talking about Sarah's example, whose daughters you are if you do well. So just as we are accounted as the children of Abraham, so also Christian women are told that they can be accounted as the daughters of Sarah, if they are following Sarah's example. And she was certainly an example of loyalty and of faithfulness. On the other hand, we find other illustrations. Sarah is used as a good example, and others are. Jezebel is mentioned back in Revelation chapter 2, and she's not used as a good example. She's, of course, the very opposite of someone like Sarah. So we have these contrasts. You go through the book of Proverbs, and we find a contrast. We find early on in the book of Proverbs, we read about what's called the strange woman. And Proverbs 31 focuses in on a virtuous woman. And so we find a contrast in character, a contrast in terms of individuals and the impact that people can have on the lives of others and the impact that women can have on the lives of others. Now, if we look at loyalty or faithfulness, the most important area of loyalty, the most important aspect of loyalty, is loyalty to God. Loyalty to God, faithfulness to God, is the basis of faithfulness in other areas of our lives. And one of the things we find as we go through Scripture is that the Bible focuses not only on men of faith, but also on women of faith. And when you go to Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, you read about not only men, but also women. Now, in many ancient societies and ancient cultures, the woman's role in terms of worship was greatly played down. It was not significant. There were maybe temple priestesses who were in reality temple prostitutes in many of the pagan religions. But in terms of the average, ordinary woman in the home, in the family. Yet, when you look through Scripture, you find women whose faith played a major role in terms of even the deliverance of the nation. The example, of course, of Esther comes to mind. We went through in Bible study this past week over here on Tuesday night, the book of Judges. And when you go through the book of Judges, you're impressed with the fact that it is that period was a period of anarchy. Virtually. It was a period, in fact, that phrase is used over and over. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That is a state of virtual anarchy. You go through the book of Judges, it is the bloodiest book in the Bible. There are all these horrible things that happen back and forth. There are people doing this and doing that. It is a very describes a very tumultuous, very difficult period. It was a period when Israel was impoverished to a great extent. There were continual incursions from various enemies who were coming in and doing things. Now, God would raise up a judge and he would deliver the nation for a while, but things very quickly got off track. Usually as soon as the judge was dead, people were off the track and running. Over and over and over again. And you go through that book and you read about all these horrible situations. Sometimes, in one case, almost an entire tribe wiped out. The tribe of Benjamin, as you read the story back in the latter part of Judges. These wars and thousands of people being butchered. Terrible things happening. A time when most of the nation was worshiping false gods over and over and over again. And yet, it's interesting, when you read the book of Ruth, the very first verse of the very first chapter says, "And it came to pass in the days of the judges." And it goes through and it tells this story. And one of the things that you're impressed with is that in the midst of confusion, in the midst of virtual anarchy, on both a political and a spiritual level, in the midst of all sorts of problems, here you have a story that focuses in on a young woman who comes to the truth of God and who makes a commitment to God and who serves God in the midst of all these things that are going on around you, because you have to read the book of Ruth in the context of the book of Judges. And it certainly points up an important lesson for each of us. And that is the fact that regardless of what is happening in society around, regardless of what's going on around us, it is possible to serve God and to have a relationship with God and to seek God in our own personal lives. And we can never use the excuse of what's happening around as an excuse for going and doing the same thing. You know, when you read the book of Ruth, she came out of a Moabite background, and if you read about the Moabites and you read about the paganism of their religion, involving even the Moabite god Chemosh, and the human sacrifices that were made, and just horrible things that occurred in their religion. Here's someone who came out of a totally pagan background, who learned the truth of God. And when the time came when her mother-in-law, who was the only part of the family left, was going back to the land of Israel, she said, "I'm going with you. I'm going with you because your people will be my people and your God will be my God. I'm not going back to the gods of Moab. I'm not going back to that past, that family." You see, there was a commitment of faithfulness and loyalty, first and foremost, that was directed toward God. She had learned about the real God, the true God, the Creator God. And she made a commitment first and foremost to God, and it showed up in her character and in her attitude. And God singles her out as one of the women to be praised in this entire book, which bears her name, and sets the stage then for the birth of King David, because she was the ancestress of King David. She was the great-grandmother of King David. And that she and her husband Boaz had a child by the name of Obed, who in turn had a child by the name of Jesse, who was the father of King David. That part of the story is told at the very end of the book. But we see an emphasis and an example in terms of loyalty. Now, there are other places that you could go to look at. Let's notice in the book of John. John chapter 19. This is the account of the crucifixion of Pilate taking Jesus and scourging him, as it mentions in verse 1, and him being led out to be crucified. Now, when you come down to verse 25, we're told, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by, whom he loved, he said unto his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. Now, it's interesting that when you came to that final moment, this was a terrible time, and we read the story and we read it from a different perspective than those who lived through it. Because if you really study the accounts, you realize this was the most unexpected, turning the world upside down kind of thing that could have happened. As far as the disciples were concerned, they weren't expecting all of this. Jesus had talked about it. He had, but Jesus often talked in parables and used stories and illustrations and said things that they didn't quite understand. And when he made comments referencing the fact of his death and of his resurrection, a lot of it sort of went in one ear and out the other. They didn't really register with it. They weren't expecting things to go quite that way. And when the soldiers came and arrested him in the garden, we read that the disciples fled. They deserted him. Now later, Peter and John sort of worked their way into the area there where the trial was being held to see what was going on. Peter went there with John. Peter wound up denying that he knew him. The indication is John was the only one of the disciples, the only one of the men that was there. But it's sort of interesting as you read the account who also was there, who didn't desert him at that most difficult and tragic of times. There was his mother, and there were the other women that it describes in various accounts add in more details. And one of the very last things that we find that was on Jesus' mind at that time was the example of making sure that his mother was properly taken care of. And, all the way through, Christ's focus and his attention was on others. But we see an example of loyalty on a spiritual level. Loyalty in terms of women who knew God and who were committed to God and committed to the truth of God and were just as faithfully committed and just as courageously committed as anyone. From a spiritual standpoint, women don't take some sort of second place. We find that the last ones there, here were the women. In fact, the very first ones to whom Jesus showed himself after his resurrection included some of the women, Mary Magdalene and others, that were there. So we read of these things, and we see an example of courageous loyalty, courageous faithfulness to God, which was a basis of determining the whole approach to life that these women had. Because ultimately, a courageous loyalty to God is the basis of loyalty to the family, loyalty to husband and children. If there's not a loyalty to God, first and foremost, then all the other loyalties are shallow and very shallowly rooted. But if first and foremost there is a loyalty to God, then it gives depth to everything else. In 1 Peter chapter 3, In 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter addresses here the matter of women. Wives, 1 Peter 3:1, he says, "Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may also without the word be won by the conduct of the wives." So he says, wives, don't be out just trying to preach to your husbands and cram it down them, but set an example. Let this term that is used here, be in subjection to your own husbands. The Greek word is hupotasso, which means to arrange under. It has to do with structure in terms of hierarchy, in terms of some sort of structure. It has to do with things being arranged. So here it talks here in terms of the governmental structure that God has set in the family, but his comment to wives is set an example, fit in terms of the role that God has set, and set an example so that even if your husband is unconverted, he may be impressed, be taken by the example that you set. Verse 2, "While they behold your chaste conduct, coupled with fear, coupled with reverence." That's what it means. Showing proper respect first and foremost to God, beholding your chaste conduct, pure conduct. You see, they see an example that they respect and appreciate. Whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair or wearing of gold or putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in the old time, the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husband. Now, again, as we look at it, who's adorning, interestingly, that word is cosmos, same word we get our word cosmopolitan from. It has to do with an arrangement of things, is what the root in the Greek language means. It's the term that is often translated world. And even in this sense, you see, whose adorning, or even whose world. Let it not be, so many times, in the message of society has to do with a woman's world sort of revolving around the things that go on the outside. And Peter says, really, your world needs to revolve around the things that are on the inside and that shine out. The hidden man of the heart. There is an attitude, there is an approach that comes forth, that shines forth from the face, from the eyes, that reflects an inner character. And we find here it talks about an attitude, a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. Here's something God places great value on. Our society doesn't place a lot of value on it. In fact, denigrates it and sort of looks down on that attitude. God says it's of great price. It is in the sight of God of great price. And this is what the holy women who trusted in God, women who also lived lives that were committed to God. Sarah, just as Abraham did, Rebekah and Rachel and others whose lives we read of in the Old Testament Scriptures, who trusted in God. And there was an attitude that was there that came forth, that reflected an inner state of mind. Let's go back to the book of Proverbs, because what we find here in Peter is also addressed elsewhere, but we find an attitude of loyalty, an attitude of here in 1 Peter 3, the description of women whose first loyalty was to God, and secondarily to their families, and who set an example of faithfulness in the family that would win the respect even of a man who was not perhaps interested in or understanding of the truth of God. Notice in the book of Proverbs, we'll go to chapter 31, in verse 10, it says, "Who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies." So when we're going to place value on something, God says if you want value, virtue has far greater value than anything else you can compare it to. Makes the point in verse 11 that the heart of her husband does safely trust in her. So we find that here is a faithful and loyal person. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. She's not going to betray him. She's not going to betray him in terms of the marriage vow. She's not going to betray his confidence. She's not one that is going to seek to embarrass or humiliate him. You see, this kind of trust is something that is at the heart and core of a relation, has to be at the heart and core of a relationship that is close, where people are sharing their lives with someone. Because if you don't safely trust someone, you're not going to open up and share the things that are deep inside of you, because there's nothing that makes you more vulnerable than opening up and expressing the things that are inside, and some of the fears and the doubts and the problems and the things that you're going through. And this principle, I think, can be applied in any context, but certainly it ought to be in the family. And so we find that the very first thing, the very first characteristic that is mentioned here when we start going through and talking about this virtuous woman whose price is far above rubies, is that her husband can safely trust in her. She's not going to betray that trust. We live in a time where marriage vows are taken very lightly. And in many cases, people do, they've run all the various polls and how, what extent you have infidelity among men and among women. And we find all of these things. There's very much a lack of loyalty. The man whose funeral I conducted yesterday, I had known for a number of years there in South Louisiana, and his wife came down with Alzheimer's back several years ago. In fact, I remember visiting with them on their 50th wedding anniversary. I didn't realize it was their 50th wedding anniversary, but it turned out to be. And she had just recently, I guess within the last year or the last 6 months, her condition had deteriorated, and she was very noticeably in the grips of Alzheimer's at that time. And he continued to take care of her and everything right on up as long as until he himself was down in bed, and his daughter has they're taking care of their mother. But the last several years have been very difficult ones for him in taking care of his wife and in the condition that she was in. And I thought that he made a comment to somebody, and they were discussing a little bit about it. And I thought he made one of the most profound comments in terms of an expression of love and loyalty for a mate. Somebody made comment, about the condition, the difficult condition that he had, difficult situation in terms of taking care of his wife. And he said, well, yeah, that was right. But he said, if I had it all to do over with, I'd still marry her. That concept of loyalty is a concept that is greatly lacking and lost in our society, our culture. People look at commitment as something to be equated with convenience. That's why we have so many lawsuits in this country. People they sign a contract. Well, they don't intend to keep it if it becomes inconvenient. They look for somebody to blame, somebody to sort of get out. They want to get out of what they're obligated to do and get somebody else to pick up the cost, to pick up the price. It reflects itself all over our society and our culture. Where's the starting point? As was addressed in the sermonette, where do we learn? Where do we begin learning? The first neighbors with whom we come in contact are our parents. The home, the family, is what shapes a society. It shapes a generation. And we are seeing increasingly, the problems that are besetting our the problems that exist in society and in the culture originate in the home. That's where it starts, because that's where we start. And those are the things that surround us, that shape us, that set the stage for the greater society and the greater culture. So we find here an example of loyalty. It says in verse 12 of Proverbs 31:12, she will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Well, it's an example of love and loyalty, of faithfulness. Loyalty and faithfulness first and foremost to God, and secondarily to the family. Faithfulness and loyalty to her husband, but coming also down as far as the children are concerned as well, because that is part of the story. If we go on back a little further in Proverbs, let's go back to Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 4. It says, "A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that makes ashamed is as rottenness in the bones." So we have a contrast between something that is a crown, and what's the basis of that? Virtue. A person who is a virtuous person has to have a commitment to God, because that is the underlying factor in terms of our character, of our conduct, of our morality, of our behavior. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. But someone who makes ashamed, that, of course, is the opposite. We come on back just a little bit. Proverbs 18. Proverbs 18 and verse 22 says, "Whoso finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor of the Lord." The next chapter 19 and verse 14, makes a similar point. It talks about that houses and riches are the inheritance of fathers. A prudent wife is from the Lord. Here's a contrast. You can leave a house, you can leave money in the bank, you can leave all sorts of physical assets. Those physical assets are the inheritance of fathers. You can leave physical things to your children, but a prudent wife, a good wife, must come from God. That's a gift from God. That's something that no matter how much a parent may desire, a good mate, a virtuous mate, a prudent mate for their child, you can't automatically control that. A prudent wife is from the Lord. That's a gift from God. That's something to be valued and appreciated as coming from God. A woman can have a tremendous impact. Proverbs 14:1 says, "Every wise woman builds her house, but the foolish plucks it down with her hands." Family life may be built or torn down by the wisdom or the folly of the mother. To a very great extent, where does she place her value? Where does she place her value? Where are her loyalties? Loyalty to God, loyalty to her husband, loyalty to her children. There is a tone that is set, and you can go through the book of Proverbs, and I think it's a good book for all of us to go back through and review on a regular basis, because it talks a lot about it talks about women as well as men. It's addressed my son, but you find that there's a lot in here for women as well. Notice in Proverbs 2:16, here's the opposite of a woman who possesses the trait of loyalty. One of the purposes of Proverbs is mentioned here in verse 16, "To deliver you from the strange woman, even from the stranger which flatters with her words, which forsakes the guide of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God." Oh, so here's someone who's not loyal and faithful. She forgets the covenant of her God. The marriage vows go out the window. She forsakes the guide of her youth. Now, there is a description here. When you come on over just a couple of chapters in verse 6, or chapter 6, in verse 24, it talks about to keep you from the evil woman, from the flattery of the tongue of a strange woman, Lust not after her beauty in your heart, neither let her take you with her eyelids. For by means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread. You know, it will ruin you in every aspect. So many times people place value on the wrong things, and so many men place value on the wrong things, and the things they're looking for don't produce the happiness and the results that they really deep down are going to desire. They're going to find themselves brought down in many ways, because the focus, God says, that bears great emphasis, the thing that is of great value, is virtue. And one of the chief virtues is the virtue of loyalty and faithfulness. Loyalty and faithfulness to God and to the family. That is the that's the starting point. We could go through many other examples and illustrations to bring that out. But you can go through and you can study those things out and see those illustrations. Now let's go on. Let's look at another valuable. It's something else of value. What can a woman give to her family? What is the most valuable thing that she can give? Well, certainly her loyalty and faithfulness is a starting point. But a woman has an important responsibility in terms of guidance in the home. 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul is addressing a matter with Timothy in terms of certain women, widows, who were free to travel, that were to be enrolled here and utilized in some special capacity in the church. All the details are not given, but Paul had instructed that these should be older women, 60 and up, as he mentions in verse 9. There was not to be, it was to be done in a way that there would be no taint of scandal as far as Timothy and some of these younger ministers, that these were to be older women that were involved and who had lived a good life, who were widows, and who had set a good example, who had a good reputation. And then he begins to talk about some of the younger women. And he mentioned that there were those who had a tendency, in verse 13, and this was not to be encouraged, to be idle, to be tattlers and busybodies. That's not something that is constructive. Rather, he said, verse 14, I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion of the adversary to speak reproachfully. To set an example. Now, what does it mean to guide the house? Well, let's look at that a little bit, because this has to do with the household and taking care of the household, maintaining oversight over the household. While God set up a governmental structure in the family, and clearly he talks about the wife being submissive, being in that sense arranged under her husband, having in terms of the governmental structure, there are plenty of scriptures, not only here, Proverbs 31 and other places, that show that it was not God's intent that a man sort of stand over and micromanage his wife in every detail. That I've seen situations where it was almost like someone was expected to give up their individuality, their personhood, and just sort of be absorbed and have every detail regimented and regulated. Well, no. God gave women minds and the ability to think and to do things just as He did for men. And the sphere of life that God has determined as the primary sphere in which to function is different. God designed that society have a certain structure. And to the extent we depart from that structure, we have problems. But here in the context of getting married and having children, there was a guidance of the household. An arrangement. This would include not only the physical things in terms of meals, in terms of producing an environment that is conducive to people spending time in, but also a matter of teaching and training of the children, which we will notice here in just a few moments. Other things that are added in this regard. Ultimately, a woman plays a major role in terms of setting the moral tone of the home. And the moral tone of the home sets the moral tone for the community and for the society. Because the home, the family, is the smallest building block of a society. And that's the most fundamental building block from which all the greater society and community grows. And a woman plays a major role in terms of guiding the home. Now, that involves physical things. There are all sorts of things that need to be taken care of. A wife can have a major impact in terms of even the health of her family by trying to ensure that nutritious meals are provided and that things are arranged. A lot of times, a lot of men left to themselves don't always pick out the most nutritious things. They, sometimes women sort of shake their heads at the things that men would live on left to themselves. But here a woman can play a major role in that regard in guiding the household. Certainly with the children, I think that's one of the major things. Let's go back here to Titus, just a few pages over. And in Titus chapter 2, Paul addresses the behavior of people. In verse 16 of chapter 1, let's pick it up and sort of get the context. He talks about individuals who profess that they know God, but in works they deny Him, being abominable and disobedient and unto every good work reprobate. They profess to know God. They talk about knowing God. But they deny Him by the way they live. They deny Him by the choices they make in life. He goes right on in chapter 2, verse 1, but you, Titus, speak the things which are conducive to sound doctrine. Then he begins to address the way people ought to conduct themselves. The older men, the older women, the younger men are all addressed. What we clearly see is that Paul equates conduct and doctrine. We can deny God by our conduct. Sound doctrine produces sound conduct. Doctrine is not intended simply to be a list of, I believe this, I don't believe that, sort of tacked on a wall somewhere, just theoretical, or just something to argue about. It is to be a way of life that is reflected in all of our endeavors. So he talks about the older men being sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in love, and in patience. So the older men have an example to set in terms of sobriety, which has to do with a sort of self-possession, someone who is the original word had the same connotation in Greek that it has in English, in terms of not drunken. When somebody is drunk, they're under the influence of alcohol. They, a lot of times, actions, words, and behavior changes because inhibitions are lessened. And people will say and do things that they wouldn't otherwise say and do. The word doesn't only have to do with that. It has to do with an approach toward life. That's the way it's used here. That there is to be a certain dignity, a certain self-control, that there is to be a soundness in faith and love and patience. Then the older women, likewise, they are to include those things, that they may be in behavior as becomes holiness. Not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children. So we find here that the older women are to play a role in guiding others, to guide the younger women. Now, one of the primary ways that all of us can impact others is by our example. How can we teach someone things that we don't know or don't practice? Well, we can't teach them very effectively, very efficiently. So again, the behavior becomes holiness. This term holiness is a different term than is usually used in the New Testament for holy. It's a word that literally has to do with the temple. And it has to do with, let's say, it would be a term that would be applied to the role of priests in the temple. The point is that a woman in her home can set an example and can have conduct that is, in that sense, sanctified or set apart just as much as the priest functioning in the temple. The functions are different, but one role can be just as pleasing to God as the other. He goes on, what are they to teach? Well, this matter of sobriety, of being devoted, as some translations renders it, devotion to their husbands, devotion to their children. So there is a proper devotion to both. You know, you don't cease being a parent when your children get older. Our children are grown and married, but you don't cease to be involved with them and to care about them and to share the things in their life, the good things and the difficult times. And we're multi-generational connection. That's something. Animals take care of their young. The mother dog or the mother cat or the cow or whatever it is will nurse the young and take care of them for a period of time. But there's not a family connection. There's not a multi-generational connection. You may have, if you've got pets or you had cats or if you had cattle, you could have maybe several generations out there, but there's not some connection. Well, that's grandmother, or that's even after they get grown, it's like that there's not even the same connection in terms of parents and children after adulthood, at least in most animals. There's not that connection over a period of time. That's something that God has given to human beings. He's given us the family unit to prepare us for what? To prepare us for the family of God. And so the things that are of value, the things that are emphasized in terms of the human family, have to do with characteristics that relate in to life in the family of God. Traits of character and ways of responding and relating to one another. So we find here that the older women were to be teachers of good things. They were to guide primarily the children and, of course, the younger women. They were to guide the younger women in terms of how to guide their own children. Verse 5, notice the traits that are mentioned. Discretion, chastity, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. You see, by our example we can bring reproach, and by our example we can bring glory. We are to glorify God in our lives and in our conduct. We can bring reproach on the name of God, reproach on the name of Christian, by our conduct, by the way we treat others, by the things that we do. Now, it's interesting to go through and make a study of these words, because these are things that the older women were to guide the younger women into. Discretion, which has to do with making choices and judgment. We're surrounded by all sorts of things. When you look at the entertainment industry, you look at what is promoted, let's say, by some of the stars, the music stars and the movie stars and all these things. What is the image? Because we do portray a certain image. Now, you find that things like modesty are not esteemed highly by our society. It's like there's a desire for a shock effect in many of these areas. Well, here the older women are to teach the younger women discretion, to teach them how to make appropriate choices of things that are, let's say, even in dress, something that is becoming, things that on the one hand will look nice, and yet also on the other hand are modest, are not designed for shock effect, are not designed to attract the wrong kind of attention. That how is a young woman going to learn to exercise discretion, to exercise good choice in terms of, let's say, what is even appropriate grooming and how to dress and how to, to walk and to sit and to do all these things, because it can be done in a provocative way. It can be done in a way that attracts the wrong kind of male attention, and it's designed for that. You see if you see a dress that's slit all, way up here, every time, a step is taken, it's sort of now you see it, now you don't. That's designed for a particular purpose. It's designed to attract attention, and the wrong kind of attention. It's designed to attract lustful attention. And whether that's consciously in the mind of the person who's wearing it or not, it's going to be consciously in the mind of a lot of those who observe her wearing it. Discretion. Learning to make good choices. Learning to what's appropriate. Younger women don't know. They don't understand maybe the fact that a man's mind works differently than a woman's mind. But, their mothers ought to understand that. Their grandmothers ought to understand that. So they're to teach discretion, teach making good choices, chastity, purity, the value of being pure, and why certain things are inappropriate. Our society takes a very lax view of chastity and purity. It is, I think, difficult for some of us who basically came to maturity prior to the, some point in the somewhere in the, let's say in the mid-60s, to realize how much the standards of society have changed in such a short time. It has been one of the most revolutionary periods, beginning with, not that there haven't always been certain problems, but in terms of what society acknowledges. Coming in with the, in the late 60s and into the early 70s, the hippie movement and the so-called free love and all of the, Woodstock and all of these things that shaped an entire generation. And we find that so many of the taboos and so many of the things have simply disappeared. And a lot of times young people sort of look at you like, which century did you hatch out? Because the standards of society have so radically changed in a matter of just a few years. I think sometimes we're not aware as to how much difference there is in terms of just what's taken for granted as normal. Now, understand, while society's standards have changed, God's standards don't change. God's standards of what's right and wrong are always what's right and wrong. And the values of the Bible doesn't mean that you're an old fogey, you're behind times. It means you're ahead of time. Because these are going to be the values that the whole world is going to have to live in just a matter of a few years. These are tomorrow's values, and we have the opportunity to live tomorrow's values today and to reap tomorrow's benefits today. But where are these things going to be learned? Where are our younger women going to learn? Where are the role models? They're going to, Madonna? Is it going to be somebody off MTV? Is it going to be the glamour girls of the movies? Where is it going to be? Where are the role models? Where are the role models? Well, the role models need to be in the home. They need to be in the church. They need to be role models that model discretion, chastity, an emphasis on home and family, an emphasis on goodness, an emphasis on respect in terms of the home, the husband. All of these things here. And again, he went on to enjoin younger men as well. Titus was to directly exhort them to be sober-minded or sound-minded. And this term is used through here. Exercising good judgment, discretion, purity. All of these things are important. Women can play a major role in terms of guiding their children, guiding older women in guiding younger women. You know, the spiritual impact, notice in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Paul tells Timothy, he says, "When I call to remembrance the unfeigned, the unpretended faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded that in you also." You know, who played a big role in shaping Timothy's life? His mother and his grandmother. Now, other accounts back in Acts were told that Timothy's father was a Greek and his mother was a Jew. And as you read the accounts, you realize that his father was antagonistic toward the religion of God, and you can demonstrate that because you find that Timothy, as a young man, had not been circumcised. His father had not allowed him to be circumcised as a child. Paul had him circumcised when he got ready to take him with him so that he would be accepted in the Jewish community because it was known that his mother was Jewish. But you know what that meant? If you go back to the Old Testament Passover, which everyone was expected to partake of, but no man could partake of the Passover if he was uncircumcised. That was part of the instructions that God had given ancient Israel. So what you find is that Timothy's father obviously wanted him excluded from, quote, things Jewish, and had ensured that Timothy not be allowed to participate in certain functions of the Jewish community. He would have been excluded from that. Would have been considered by the other Jews as outside the covenant. But you know, his mother and his grandmother clearly had done a good job of teaching him and of directing him, of guiding him. So that as a young man, when he was receptive, and they were converted, and he was. Played a big role in that. There are other examples. Notice back in Proverbs 31 again, in terms of guiding. Proverbs 31 verse 1. "The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him." So here is, and if you put this together, most commentaries will acknowledge that Lemuel was a name for Solomon. So what we read here in Proverbs 31 are the teachings of Solomon's mother. She's the one who told him what to look for in a woman. Now, unfortunately, Solomon didn't. He forgot what his mother taught him. That's another story. But his mother taught him. She guided him. And she told him in verse 3, "Give not your strength unto women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings." She warned him, you see, about womanizing, which is what he did, and what did wind up destroying his kingdom. It's not for kings, O Lemuel, it's not for kings to drink wine, or princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert judgment. So she warned him about being temperate. His mother gave him some good advice. She sought to guide him. In his latter years, he forgot advice that his mother and his father had given him. But here was advice, here was guidance in the form of about matters of morality and temperance. On down later on in chapter 31, verse 26, talking here of the virtuous woman, "She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looks well to the ways of her household and eats not the bread of idleness." So she opens her mouth with wisdom. She is a thinking person. She studies God's Word. She thinks. She meditates. And so she's able to open her mouth with wisdom. Because if you're not studying God's Word, if you're not meditating on God's Word, if you're not walking with God in your personal life, if you're not praying to God, how are you going to have wisdom to come forth? She opens her mouth with wisdom. So here is someone who is a thinking person, who's analyzing and thinking about and trying to apply the principles of God's Word. In her tongue is the law of kindness. So she's able to deal in a kind and a gentle way. So she guides in terms of teaching. She also guides in terms of looking well to the ways of her household. She makes sure she's not a lazy, idle person who's spending her day watching the soap operas and the talk shows, the Oprahs and the Jenny Joneses and whatever. Rather, she's looking well to the ways of her household. She's concerned about the family's health, about all of these things, and trying to make the house a home. So we can look to all these examples that come out, and we find in verse 28, the result of that, her children arise up and they call her blessed. Or, as it can also be translated, they make her happy. Her husband also, and he praises her. And I think that's a point that husbands ought to think about, that we give proper praise and respect to our wives. Too many times people make disparaging or sort of put-down comments or embarrassing comments about one another, make some sort of negative comment that's just totally out of place, and certainly in any sort of public venue. So we find here an example. A virtuous woman offers her loyalty to God and family, offers her guidance, and she also offers her love. Loyalty and faithfulness and guidance are very important. Notice in Titus chapter 2, we read the verse just a matter of moments ago. But let's just focus in on just this one aspect of it. The older women are to teach the younger women what? To love their own husbands. To love their children. They're to teach by way of example and word how to show real love in the family. How to give love to the family. How to give love to her husband and to her children. Mr. Armstrong used to talk a lot about the subject of love. And he explained that love is not just a feeling or an emotion. Now, there is an emotional component. But love's not just a feeling or an emotion. Real love, true love, is outgoing concern. He would often use the two simple terms of reflecting two ways of life, the way of get and the way of give. Love is the way of give, the way of outgoing concern, the way of helping and sharing and building, the way of trying to build up and encourage others. It involves a giving of ourselves. And that is a vital component. We learn to love in the context of the family. It tells us in 1 John, speaking of our relationship with God, it says we love Him because He first loved us. How does a little child learn to show and express affection? How does a little child learn to be loving? Because of the way he's treated. Even an animal learns by the way he's treated. You can take a little puppy that has been mistreated and abused, and what do? Well, they want to go hide. They don't want you to pick them up. They're frightened. Remember, we got a little dog one time that had obviously been mistreated, and you could see it in the way that he conducted himself, and how he would be frightened and try to hide, and found it difficult to trust. Now, if a little animal with their little tiny animal brain picks up on those things, how much more on a human level do little children pick up? And we learn to love, we learn to trust, we learn to be affectionate, we learn to show love by receiving love. There are things that set the stage for a person being loving and kind and affectionate, and there are things that set the stage for a person being withdrawn, being distrustful, having barriers and being sort of alienated, unable to relate and connect with other people. The starting point to learning how to love, because you and I aren't born just automatically knowing how to love. But a little child learns. You see, we learn to love God because He first loved us. He took the initiative. And our love for God is a response to God's love for us. And in the family, a little child's love, in the first place he can express that love is toward his parents. And the mother is usually the one that has the primary impact, particularly in the very earliest time, because she's taking care of him, she's nursing him, she's carried him in her body for 9 months. And she gives birth to him, and she is the one who takes him and holds him and nurses the child. Now, certainly the father ought to be involved, and he ought to be giving love and affection as well. But children learn to love and to express love as a response to being loved. And the way that they are trained and taught, the way that they are treated from the earliest moments of their life, set the stage for their ability to respond with love and trust through life. So here, Paul emphasized to Titus to encourage the older women to help the younger women learn how to properly express love to their husbands and love to their children. Because love is a valuable thing to give. You know, it's interesting. Solomon's... Have you ever thought about this, that Solomon's reputation for wisdom was established on one particular incident that happened early in his reign? There was, you remember the story? It's told back in 2 Kings 3, or 1 Kings 3. Solomon had recently become king, and he was a young man. He had prayed and asked God for wisdom, and a situation came to his attention that nobody knew how to resolve. 2 women showed up with one baby. Remember the story? They had each given birth to a child, and one of them had her child had died. She evidently, as it describes it, she had maybe smothered the baby accidentally or something. The child had died, and so she switched the babies. They were living there in the same home, and she became aware that her baby had died, so she switched the babies with the other woman. And the other woman, when she woke up, she knew that the dead baby wasn't hers. And you can just imagine, the emotions that were involved. And nobody knew how to resolve that. Here, one woman's word against the other. And it came to Solomon. Solomon's reputation for wisdom really sort of exploded from that point on. And people marveled. But you see, ultimately, that Solomon's decision on the matter, was established based on his knowledge of a mother's love. Because you remember the story, he told them, all right, you got the live baby. He said, well, they're arguing, they can't agree who it belongs to. Bring it over here, take a sword, let's just cut it in 2 and give each of them 1/2. And immediately the true mother spoke up and said, no, don't do that. Give her the baby. And Solomon said, all right, it's very obvious who the child belongs to. It's obvious who the mother is. It's obvious who loves that baby, because she would rather give up the baby than see it harmed. She puts that her attachment to that child is greater than her desire for what she wants. She'd rather give the child up than to see it harmed. Obviously, she's the mother. She's the one who loves the child. Solomon's decision was based on determining very quickly who really loved the child. I think it's interesting as you look through that and we see that example. God has made us male and female. He's made us in the image of God. But He's also made us different. Back several years ago, Time magazine had a cover story and said, men and women really are different. And they were quoting, there was a government study, some of your tax dollars at work, millions of dollars had been spent, and various professors had made studies, and they had come to an amazing conclusion. Men and women are different. I think most of us could have saved them a lot of money. In fact, I think they could have gone just about anywhere over the world. They could have gone into some little obscure village somewhere in a third world country and asked somebody, and they could have told them, yeah, men and women are different. People, it seems like everybody had that figured out except some of these hot shots who were so smart. And anyway, they spent a lot of money, and they came to the conclusion, yes, men and women really were different. And that it was biological. It wasn't just all just cultural and what was taught, much to the women's libers' displeasure, discomfort. Because, you see, the false idea has been foisted off that only, and this is most of the The women's lib crowd would have great difficulty acknowledging accepting this, but this is really what so much of it is built on. The false concept that the only values or the only traits that really have value or the things that have value are in the masculine realm, and therefore women have to compete in a, quote, man's world and go out and be the soldiers and the sailors and the policemen and the firemen and all of these things, and they've got to go out and compete in the man's world, or otherwise they don't really have value. You're not worth as much. And so while women have been trying to do man's work and fit into the man's world, who's been left to do woman's work? Who's been left to guide the home? Who's been left to contribute the things that are of such inestimable value in terms of setting the tone for the whole culture and society, beginning at the birth of children all the way on up, setting a tone. And at every stage in our life, the specifics of what we may do when you're young, or when you have young children, or when you have teenagers, or when your children are grown, or when you're a grandparent, the specifics of what you may do will vary over the years depending on your age and circumstance. But the principles and the characteristics that have value never change. We live in a society that's paying the penalty for not having properly recognized the great value that the proper feminine and masculine roles are intended to contribute. The characteristics of loyalty and faithfulness, of providing guidance, of offering love, are characteristics of tremendous value. They are things that don't pass out of style, because they are the basis of a set of values that shape our homes, our communities, our entire society and culture. So much of it has been lost sight of in our end of the 20th century Western world. But these are values that will be retaught, reemphasized, reinculcated into generations in the future to produce the kind of world that is described in the prophets, the time when the knowledge of God covers the earth like the waters cover the sea.